Okay. Can you guys hear me in the back? Everyone good? Hello. What's up? Cool. Okay, so it's Berkeley time, so we're gonna start. Let me hide this. Okay. Hello, everyone. So today we're gonna be covering CSS1, which is the fundamentals of CSS. This should be a pretty interesting lecture. Basically, we're gonna cover all the tools that you need to make your website look really pretty. Personally, that's something that I really enjoy doing, so excited to be teaching. Yeah, so before we get started, if you guys have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand. I'll stop very frequently for questions because the lecture content is pretty dense today. So definitely, be paying attention and come with any questions that you have. Also at the end, there should be some extra time. So I will be around to answer any questions that you have as well. So yeah, okay, let's get started. So before we start diving into the content, just want to introduce myself. I don't think we've really met before. My name is Vicky. I'm a third year studying computer science. That's not me. That's just a photo that I like. But that is my Piazza profile photo. But yeah, I used to be one of the co-presidents and founders of WDB. I primarily focus on front-end development when it comes to engineering, but I recently switched into product design. So yeah, that's just kind of my background. And yeah, it's good to see all of your faces here today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the content that we'll be presenting today. Cool, so let's dive right in. So just to start off, I'd like to go over what exactly CSS is. I think it's a little bit hard to grasp exactly how it works at first, so I want to kind of go back to the house analogy that we've been talking about. I'm not sure if you guys are all familiar with the house analogy. It's kind of just an easier way to understand how the basic stack works. So HTML is what you guys learned on Tuesday. And HTML basically includes all the raw materials like the lumber, the screws I'm sure there's more that you need to build a house. I'm not an architect. And basically just the bare bones architecture of the house, like this frame, like pictured right here. So with your knowledge right now in HTML, this is an example of something you can build if you're building a house. But it doesn't really look very comfortable. It doesn't really look like a home or inhabitable at all, actually. So CSS basically allows you to make your house a home. So with CSS, you can do things like in this photo, you could paint the house a nice shade of white. Instead of having a square house, you can make it an oval. You can change up the layout of your furniture, and you can do a lot more, which we'll be going over in lecture today. So yeah. Cool, so now let's take this house analogy to the web so you guys can get a more concrete understanding of what exactly HTML and CSS do and how they work together. So take a look at this photo right here. This is Facebook in basic HTML. It looks like it's their login page. I'm sure you guys have all stumbled across a website when your internet connection's bad, where it literally just looks like a jumble of very basic site elements. Something you might notice in this photo is that there's only one font. There's no colors. It's black and white besides like the default blue of the links. It's kind of ugly and probably not a website that you'd want to use. And I'm sure if you stumble across a site like this, you're probably going to look for another site. So yeah, it's not great. But this is what a basic HTML website looks like. So this has no CSS on it and it has no styling on it. Hello everyone who's coming in. So yeah, now let's take a look at what Facebook looks like. I mean, you guys probably all know what it looks like, but this is an example of what CSS enables you to do. For example, here you can see you can add custom colors. It's no longer a white background. You can resize the images. You can add different fonts. You can change the structure and layout of all the elements in your website instead of everything just falling into a list. And the core thing I want you guys to understand before we dive into the nitty-gritty of CSS is that CSS is essentially a list of rules that you'll give the browser. So CSS file has a bunch of selectors that will tell you, that will tell the browser how to style specific elements that can be found in your HTML document. And those elements are the tags and the different items that you can put in your website that you guys learned on Tuesday. So for example, your CSS will say something like all H1s will be colored red, all images will be 100 pixels wide. Of course, it wouldn't be in plain English. We'll go over the syntax soon, but this is just kind of the core idea of what CSS does. It looks at your website and it says, or it looks at your HTML and grabs specific elements to apply styles onto them. So yeah. before we go into this, does anyone have any questions about that? Or just need any more clarification on how CSS and HTML work together? Okay, awesome. All right, so just quickly to review HTML, what you guys learned on Tuesday is that HTML documents are they consist of tags. So these are things like divs, H3s, unordered lists, and many, many more that you guys hopefully were able to explore. The way that you name HTML tags are with classes and IDs, also something you guys learned last time during lecture. So you can give a div a class name, you can give it an ID name. This should all be reviewed. But basically CSS, like I said, is a list of rules. Just really want to nail that in. CSS searches for elements via tags, classes, and IDs in your HTML document and applies style onto them. This is kind of redundant to what I said earlier, but making all elements with the class name container bright red, making all paragraphs have size 14 font, all just more examples of what you can do with CSS. Yeah. Cool, so just to start moving on into the syntax. So this is what every block of CSS contains. So this is kind of the core building block of what makes a CSS file. Oh, by the way, CSS stands for cascading style sheets. You'll learn why it's cascading on next Tuesday's lecture. But yeah, that's what it stands for. So yeah, so first thing that CSS block consists of is a selector. A selector is what I was talking about earlier, the way that you identify and basically grab elements for HTML and apply styles onto them. So in this example, the selector is an H2. So your browser will read the CSS document and look for all the H2s inside of your HTML document, make the color red, the width 20 pixels, and the height 40 pixels. And in the blue is a property. So that's just like a type of thing that you can change about an element. And then the value is it's pretty self-explanatory, value that you assign to that attribute. And every line of CSS should be followed by a semicolon, or else your IDE will yell at you. So yeah, cool. So before I move on, any questions? Just want to make sure you guys are very clear on what CSS does. Okay, wonderful. All right, so now we're going to move on into actually how to bring CSS into your HTML. So yeah, there's three main ways that you can do this. I'll go into depth and show you guys examples of how each of these work. So number one is by using the style attribute. So I'm not sure how in depth you guys went on this, but each HTML tag can take on attributes, right? So for example, href or source are examples of attributes. Style is another attribute that can be taken on by an HTML tag. And something to note about the style attribute is that this is what we call inline CSS. So you're basically putting the CSS directly into the HTML document, which is directly in line with the HTML code that you're writing. And one thing to remember is that inline style will always overwrite any external style sheet or the style tag that is covered in the middle column here, which we'll talk more about later. So just remember that inline style is very powerful and it overrides every other form of styling. And another thing to note is that the styling in inline style only applies to the element that has that attribute. So if you have an H1 with the style tag that says this H1 should be blue, it won't affect any of the other H1s on the page. And something to keep in mind is that this is kind of like a sledgehammer approach. Like what that means is that it kind of, like I said, since it overrides everything, like it really only should be used for things that maybe fall out of a pattern and are going to be really hard to identify in your CSS. So you shouldn't need to rely on this, and you should really only use it if you desperately need to, because you're trying to write code that is, can be reused and easily understood. So when something kind of falls out of the pattern, it can be harder to kind of figure out like where the style is coming from. So definitely try to not rely on the style attribute. But yeah, so now that we know what that is, I'll go into an HTML document and show you guys what a style attribute looks like in the HTML code. So if you guys want to follow along, feel free to open up your VS Codes. I'll give you guys a second to do that, or whatever code editor you like to use. And then when you're in there, just create a new file. We'll call it like test HTML, call it whatever you want. And then remember that if you want the boilerplate of an HTML file, you can press or type an exclamation mark. And if you press enter, at least in VS Code, it should give you the bare bones of an HTML document. So yeah, I'll give you guys like a little bit of time to do that in case you guys want to follow along. All right. Anyone need more time? We good? Okay. Awesome. So I'm gonna not be using this, but yeah, so type the exclamation mark, get your boilerplate going, and then we'll start working inside the file if you guys want to follow along. So yeah, ignore everything else on here. Going back to what we were talking about the style attribute, which is inline CSS inside of your HTML document. So right now we're still working in HTML. We haven't touched any .css files yet, which we'll get into very soon. So this is an example of the implementation of a style attribute. So if you guys want to type this out, just to follow along, this is an H1. And as you can see, it has the word style attribute header 1 inside of it, which is shown on the right-hand side here. And currently it's red because we specified inline style to have this H1 be of the color red. Pretty self-explanatory. If you want to make it yellow, for example, as you can see, well, you can't read it, but it is yellow. So let's change that back to red. But yeah, so that's an example of inline CSS, the style attribute. It's pretty simple. One thing to keep in mind is that here, like the style is a string. So you wouldn't like paste in the raw CSS. You would just like separate these like properties and value assignments as with commas and then make it a string. So yeah, just keep that in mind. And yeah, so that is an example of an inline CSS style attribute. And then, like I said earlier, it does override everything else that tries to style the same element. So for example, up here, right, we have a style tag that says that the H1 should be blue, right? But as you can see, that is not true because this inline style has overridden this blue specification up here. So yeah, that's just an example of how it overrides other attempts at styling the same element. So yeah, moving on into number 2, which is the style tag. So the style tag is another type of HTML tag. You guys have already learned a lot, but another one, here's another one. So the style tag is also inserting CSS classes directly into your HTML file. Something to note here is that it only overrides external style sheets if you place it after importing your external style sheet. So for example, here, this is the style tag that I was talking about. As you can see, it comes after like this external sheet. Actually, I won't go into that yet. I'll talk about that after we talk about what an external style sheet is. But basically, the style tag goes into the head of your HTML document, along with all the meta tags in the title. And also, this usually isn't preferable to use if you have like a very long CSS file. Doesn't really make sense to put it in the same file if it's going to interfere with your ability to read the HTML document. Generally, it's good practice to separate out, different components of a website. So if one file only concerns styling, you should probably keep it separate from all like the elements in your HTML document, which brings us into the link tag. So this is another type of HTML tag. I think you guys may have covered the link tag, but one way to use it is to import a style sheet. And this is typically the most common way to implement CSS. So like I said earlier, it's pretty good practice to keep CSS separate because it only concerns style and it doesn't concern the actual like content of what is on the website. So yeah. And typically CSS files end in .css, or sorry, they always do. I don't know why I said typically. So yeah, .css files contain CSS. So yeah, this is an example of a link tag, and it consists of 3 things. Number 1, of course, is like the link tag name. And then you have, in order to kind of let it know that it's importing or a style sheet, basically rels just stands for relationship. So it tells this tag, like this is what you're getting. You're getting a style sheet. And then the href, I think that's like hypertext reference, basically just points to the file that you're trying to import, which right now is main CSS. So if you guys want to make your first, or maybe first CSS file, you can go ahead and do that in the same folder. So just right click, new file, and then call it whatever you want. And then if it's in the same folder, you should be able to import it by just referring to the file name. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time to create your CSS file. All right. Cool. So yeah, now let's play around with kind of what an external style sheet does. So basically, this is what a CSS file typically looks like. Up here, this is an example of a block that I showed you guys earlier. Like I mentioned earlier, we have the selector, and then we have properties, and then we have values that we assign them to. So basically, your CSS file will look like a long list of selectors, which can be a little bit confusing. But yeah, so basically, in this file, we can see that we have an H1 selector that is trying to turn all H1 text into the color aquamarine, right? But we can see right here that that's not happening. These are still red and blue, even though we have two H1 elements in here that should, in theory, be styled by this external spreadsheet that you just imported in, right? So like I mentioned earlier, the order of these tags up here matters, because what your browser is going to do is it is going to read through this document and say, okay, I've imported the style sheet, but now I see that there's another tag telling me to do something else. So I'm going to listen to the thing that comes after it. So yeah, just keep that in mind. In theory, if we move this one down here, it should work. It is not working. Let's see. Let's see what's going on. Oh, here we go. That's what. Okay, please ignore that. Okay, there we go. Sorry, ignore this. Pretend that's never there. If you guys want to follow along, just type in this H1 selector up here. And yeah, like you just saw, if we turn this yellow now, it should work because we have moved this after. I'm just going to go back and put it up here just to demonstrate that again. And then yeah, it should be blue because now it sees that H1 should be blue. But yeah, okay. So those are the three main ways that you can implement CSS into your HTML document. Hopefully it's starting to kind of like the picture of how HTML and CSS work together is starting to take form. So yeah, does anyone have questions on any of these ideas? Okay, awesome. All right, so now we're going to move on into writing actual CSS files. So we're first going to start by talking about selectors in general. So basically, as you can see, there are many ways to style one single element. An element obviously, has a tag, which is, it can be a div, it can be a paragraph, it can be an image, but it can also have things like a class, ID, or even multiple classes sometimes. So some of you might already be wondering what happens if you use two methods of selecting, oh, that should say class, oh wait, never mind. Selecting a class that might clash with each other. So let's say you have an H1 that has a class name of like box. You have one selector that is selecting the H1 and one selector that is selecting the class name. You might be curious how those two methods will clash with each other potentially and ways that we can mitigate that. So there's nothing to worry about because we have this concept called specificity, which you guys will dive into deeper during the CSS2 lecture, I believe. But what you need to know for now is that specificity creates kind of a hierarchy of what selectors are most powerful. So down here, we can see kind of the order of how it goes. So universal selectors, which is the asterisk, I'll cover that soon, are kind of the most powerful. Everything else can override that. A tag is next, and then it goes class, ID, and then an inline style, an style tag in your HTML document, and then an inline style. style attribute. So yeah, basically what this means is that, let's say you select H1, like an H1 tag, and you also select it using its class name. The styling that you apply by selecting its class name will override the styling that applies when you select it with its tag name. So hopefully it's not too confusing, but now we'll move on into what exactly each of the selectors are. And like I said, you will dive deeper into specificity on Tuesday next week. So yeah, we'll start with the universal selector. So this is the asterisk. This selector, basically what it does, it affects all of the CSS classes in your document. So for example, this is a universal selector. So this property, well, you can kind of imagine that it kind of affects or is kind of added onto every single other selector. Like it affects, it kind of exists everywhere and it touches everything that you're trying to style, which is often helpful. And I'll go into why we use this box sizing property at the very end. But yeah, that's what a universal selector is. Honestly, most times you're not going to use it very much because most things that you're styling aren't going to all look the same or all behave the same way. So, it's just something that's good to keep in mind. It's the least specific, so it doesn't override any other form of selector. All right, so next we have the tag selector. The tag selector selects elements based on tags. So if you have, let's say, an image selector inside of your CSS file, it will apply that styling onto every single image that lives in your HTML. So this is an example of an H1 selector that basically tries to grab every H1 from HTML and styles it with the color yellow unless, overridden by another styling method. So yeah, yeah, cool. And then next we have the class selector, which selects elements by classes. Classes can be shared by many elements, which can kind of get a little bit confusing. So we will talk about best practices on how to, write your selectors later on. And something to note with class selectors is that in your CSS, when selecting that specific class name, you will indicate that it's a class by beginning the name with a period. So right here, for example, we're selecting elements with the class name grid, and we indicate that it's a class name and not like a tag, for example, sorry, I forgot to mention here, but in tag selectors, you don't have to indicate with a period. It's just purely like the name of the tag. But with classes, you do have to add a period at the start. So yeah, an example of that would be in here. This is an example of a class selector. I will uncomment this later. But yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. And in your HTML, the class name B is right here. So yeah, that's kind of how it grabs elements based on class name. And then similarly, you have the ID selector, which is specified, by the ID of an element. Also, try to avoid these when possible, because typically IDs indicate like unique elements in the page. So usually it's like, one-off situation that you might need to use this. So yeah, in your CSS ID names, to indicate that it's an ID, begins with a hashtag. So this is telling this code block below, tells the browser that you should be looking for elements with the ID header block, not the class name header block, and ID, because you have the hashtag at the start. So yeah, cool. Awesome. And then this I already covered earlier. Style tags placed after the link tag will override link tags as external CSS, and inline styling will override everything else. Yeah, all right, cool. Does anyone have any questions on selectors? Yeah.
So classes can be applied to multiple elements, but IDs cannot.
Yeah, so you can, I think, technically give multiple elements the same ID, but it's not like you should use classes if you're trying to kind of group multiple elements into the same group. IDs should be unique, yeah. All right. Cool, then we'll move on into some common properties that you might be using when you're trying to build a website. So yeah, this is this is just a list of them, which isn't very helpful. But I'll go in and demo exactly what each of these do. They're typically pretty, intuitive when it comes to like the naming convention. So you'll just see them in action and see different like ways that you can use them. So first we'll cover text properties that you might commonly use. So yeah, for that, we will go into the demo. Yeah, so if you guys want to follow along in your CSS file, I'm going to uncomment this line of HTML. You can put whatever you want in here, but right now we have a paragraph tag with the class name B, and it's the very beginning of the B script, according to all known laws of aviation. All right, and then in your main.css file, you'll select this by using a class selector. So yeah, that's kind of how we'll set it up. So if you guys want to set it up and follow along, definitely I encourage you to do so, because especially if you're using Visual Studio Code, you get a lot of like the color options. So you can see like all the different options you have for every property that you use. So it's good to kind of, know what your options are. You'll explore those more as you continue to build. So yeah, awesome. So the first, I'm gonna reload this. All right, so as we can see here, this is our little piece of text. So we're gonna start by changing this text to be a little bit more readable by changing the size of the font. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's called font size. I would recommend that you guys always have w3schools.com open because it'll tell you like what the names of all the properties are. At first, when you're trying to use them, it can be a little hard to like understand exactly what the name is. Like font size could be text size. It could, that would make sense too. But you do have to use font size if you're trying to change the name the size of the font. So just like, reference the internet often. It's very easy to forget, but as you work with it, you'll definitely get used to it and kind of it becomes muscle memory. So yes, let's start by adding a font size property that changes our font to be a little bit bigger. So we'll set it to a size of 40 pixels. And if we reload on the side, we can see that it has gone significantly larger. And feel free to make it like 6,000 pixels on your own if you want to try. Just see what happens. And then next, we can change the color of our text. So if you type like any letter after this colon, it'll give you like a nice list of, potential colors that you can use. Yeah, feel free to like, there's a lot of built or like default colors that you can choose from. So yeah, I really like just looking at the colors. But yeah, for now, let's go with chocolate. So yeah, let's make this text chocolate, and then we can see that it changes to this nice brown color. Yeah. All right, so next we'll talk about letter spacing. Sometimes you want to make, basically letter spacing is just how much space is in between the letters, not rocket science. So you can, as you can see, it became bigger. I'll explain what REM means later. I shouldn't have put this in here. Let's make this like 30 pixels. So yeah, I don't know, there's not too many cases where you want to use this, but it is an option. So let's make it look normal. All right, and then we have line height, which specifies how much space you want in between the lines of your text. So right now it's 30 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. All right, and then we can make it very large, very nice. Let's make it like 20. Cool. All right, and then next we have font weight. Font weight is the boldness of your font. So there's two ways to specify this. Number one, you can use multiples of 100. For example, 500 is like medium. 700 is like bold or semi-bold. I don't know. No, that doesn't exist. I'm sorry. You can also say like, you can just type in bold, I believe, and it should work. I think there also is lighter. Yeah. So yeah, just explore the options that there are. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but this is how you kind of change the boldness of your font. So yeah, sorry, I'm gonna make this larger. All right, and then next we can specify font family. So I'm actually gonna type this out. Font family is just, it's like the typeface that you're using. There's a lot of default options that you can look around in. I believe we will cover how to import like your own personal fonts like that maybe are from your local machine or from like Google Fonts. But for now, just look around. I've never used Fantasy. I don't know what that is. But it's not great, but it's there. So yeah, that's what font family is. And then next we have text align, which is by default, I believe, centered, but it's pretty simple. It's text justify. You also can do right, pretty simple. And then next we'll talk about text decoration. So text decoration is basically like an underline. You can do like underline, overline. We'll look into some options. So here, let's see. We can create a nice green overline for the text, which I don't know in what situation you'd really want to use this, but you probably might want to underline things. So yeah, you can do that. You can also change, like I believe you can make it dotted. There's a lot of different options. You can ask the internet if you want to explore other ones. There's double. And then this is just the thickness of the line, which I don't know why. Okay, yeah. Great. Now we know how to do that. And then there also is a way to shorthand do all of them together. So this is like it's the style or like what you want it to be. And then this is the color. And then the third keyword that you specify is like the style. And then the last one is the thickness. So basically if you can do it all in one line, so you don't have to type out like 4 separate lines. And as you can see, it should create let's make this like blue underline that overrides these previous ones. So yeah, I guess just to briefly introduce, the order also matters in your CSS files. So like we just saw, any declaration that comes after will override everything before it. So yeah, keep that in mind. If you're ever confused why something doesn't look right, see if there's anything that's like styling it later down or like further down in the style sheet that might be interfering. And then you can also do text transform. If you want it to be really aggressive, you can make it uppercase. So yeah, great. So that is a basic overview of some of the more common text properties that you can use. Does anyone have any questions on any of these? Yes, in the back. Can you show the HTML? Yes, of course. So basically, it's just a paragraph tag. Sorry, I'm just gonna press in a new line. Yeah, you can put anything in the text. You can also give it a different class name. But yeah, good, awesome. Yes. Yeah. So this is an example of how you would import an external style sheet. So we're using the link tag. And this relationship attribute tells the tag that it's a style sheet. And then the href is just the path name that you need to get to the file that you want to import. So since it's in the same folder, we can just specify that its name is main CSS. I think this would also work. Yeah, is that good? Does that make more sense? Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So now we can move on to kind of more common properties that work for most types of things within or most types of tags. So for this, I will demo on a photo as well as a div. So this is just kind of a broad overview of some properties that we'll be going over. So yeah, let's go back into our HTML. And what we're going to do is I'm going to, okay. So what I did here is I have 2 elements I'm adding to the HTML doc. Number 1 is just a regular div. As it says here, a regular old div. And then it has a class name of regular div, pretty simple. And then here I have an image tag. If you guys want to add an image, you just have to upload it into the same file. and then use the image tag with the source attribute, and then feed in the path name to the image. You don't have to do this. It's just I will be demonstrating on an image for so that you guys can see some of the properties better. But yeah, I'll give you guys a little bit of time to import something if you want to, and just to set up the HTML in general. All right. Okay, cool. Feel free to continue working on that if you need, but I will first move on into manipulating some of the CSS to make our divs and our images look a little bit more interesting. All right, so this is what we have. The photo of Barry B. Yeah, okay, so here is the text, the div that contains this text regular old div. You probably usually shouldn't just put text into a div, but this is just for example purposes. And then we have this image here, which we'll be playing around with in our CSS. So yeah, I believe if you guys want to follow along, the class name is called, or sorry, the div's class name is just called regular div. And then the image is called Barry. Amazing. All right, so first we're going to take a look at the image. So this is what it looks like. So we'll first start by manipulating the width and the height of our image. So here, basically we're specifying that the image should have a width of 300 pixels. And if we reload, we can see that it sizes down to 300. It is a little bit small, so I'm gonna, like 600 sounds good. So yeah, and then we can also change the height of the image. I'll just 300. If we really want to, like, you guys can better see what that would look like. Probably wouldn't want to do that. But yeah, that's fine. So it's 400 pixels high now. And then next we'll move on into z-index. So z-index is basically how, like, the arrangement of things that might be overlapping. So anything with the higher z-index will fall on top of other elements who have lower z-indexes. So if you have this image, if you give it a z-index of -1, I don't think we can, let's make ignore what I'm doing. I'm just gonna try to put it on top of something. Okay, there we go. So now we can see that the image falls under the text. If you want, or if you need to make things overlap, this is really good, or I guess the only way to kind of control the way that things fall on top of each other. If you gave this a z-index of 1, it would go on top because the default z-index, if you don't specify, is 0. So yeah, as you can see, -1 takes it below, and then any number greater than 0 should bring it above. So yeah, that's just an example of the z-index. Let's remove that. All right, so back to the image. Another thing we can do is give our elements a drop shadow. Drop shadow is just a shadow behind the element. So the way you do that is by specifying the property box shadow. And I think the way that this works is this first value here is the X offset, which is how far away from, like, the center in the X direction does the shadow move. And then this is the Y offset. This is the amount of blur that you want the shadow to have. And then this is the color. So we'll see what it looks like here. So as you can see, or might not be super clear, but if we make this something like very big, you can see in the X direction, the shadow moves like away from the center of the image or any element that you apply this onto. But if we give both of them the same, it should kind of just center off. And then let's give this like a 20 blur, and you can kind of see it gets a little bit more blurry. It's like kind of stylistic depends on what you want to do with it. And then the color you can change to anything, I believe. So yeah, if you want to make it look extra interesting, you can do that. And yeah, so next we have border radius. Border radius is pretty useful. So if you want to give like a div or an image, like rounded corners, this is how you do it. So I give it a border radius of 10, which as you can, oh, it's not super dramatic, but you can see that the sides of the image get round, which is pretty useful. And then next, okay, actually, no, we aren't going to talk about that yet. So yeah, those are the examples I would go through with the photo. Next, we're going to move on to this regular div that we have, which is currently right here. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see. It's right there. But yeah, so what we're going to show here is the background color property. So if we give it a background color of indigo, you can see that the entire div, which spans this entire page, gets filled in by the color that you specify. Another thing you can do is give divs a background image. That's also a property that you can use. But a lot of times you might just want to use like an actual image tag in your HTML. And then we have opacity, which specifies how opaque the element should be. And it's not just the background, it includes everything inside the div. So all the, yeah, so as you can see, like this gets very light if we specify like a low opacity. And then if you take it up, I think it's between 0 and 1, it should be more opaque. So yeah. So those are all not, okay, definitely not all of the properties that exist in CSS. There are a lot of different options and like things that you can change. I mean, if you take a look at any like website, there's some very like complicated, elements on there that are like very stylized, and CSS can enable you to do a lot of things, including like animations, like basic animations on your site. So definitely a lot to explore with CSS, but hopefully like going through these examples of properties kind of helps illustrate like the power of CSS and what exactly it can do for you. And each one of these things, obviously isn't going to make a huge difference in your website, but when you put everything together, you can, make pretty good replicas of like common websites that you use, and do some pretty cool things. So definitely recommend you guys searching up more properties, and may also, exploring animations, which I think we'll cover later, that are very powerful and can make your website look very solid just with basic CSS. Yeah, okay. Does anyone have any questions about these? Yes.
So like the class area seems to be very like specific to like image.
Yeah.
So if you were to like add, I mean, for whatever, I don't know what the reason would be, like, but like if you were to add that class instead to like a text or like a header, would it just kind of like ignore everything that doesn't apply to it, or would it kind of like error?
Let's see. So with this, yes, it is pretty specific to like an image. You can do this on a div as well. With text, I believe like something like border radius probably wouldn't work super well. There are definitely properties that do apply. I believe, opacity, z-index, width, and height. Shadow also, I believe, applies on the text. But let's try to like take this like H1 here and give it, let's see if we can make it like for example, let's try to change the box shadow of it and give it like 10 pixels. Oh, fuck. Wait, sorry. I'm so sorry. No, okay. Sorry, not this. Border radius is what I was talking about. I apologize profusely. Yeah, so as you can see, it doesn't do anything. It won't tell you like anything's wrong, which in this case, like I'm not sure if you would ever want to like round the corners of your text. But CSS, like, unless it's like syntactical, usually it just ignores everything. And at the very end, we'll talk about a way to kind of see which attributes have been ignored using dev tools or developer tools in your browser. But yeah, it usually won't get angry at you. It just doesn't really work. Yeah.
But like, eventually we make classes that kind of, or just like, are like used for images or text or whatever, like
oh,
it towards one or the other.
Usually you don't have to pay attention to that too much because there isn't like a certain set of properties that you like have to use. Usually like the way that you name your classes or create classes should be based on like the function of the element. It shouldn't be super specific a lot of the times. Like for example, this like red header up here, like you'd probably just want to name it something like title, right? Because that kind of describes like the function of what it does on the page. For example, you wouldn't want to make it like red title because let's say you want to change it to green one day, you're going to have to go through and change all the class names as well. So the way that you like create those classes should kind of be based on the function and not necessarily how like it might look. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, cool. So now we're going to move on to units and measurements. There's a lot of text on this slide. So yeah, we'll just go over these. So basically, there's a few different ways. So starting on the left-hand side, we'll talk about different ways that you can size things. So as I was demonstrating earlier, we used pixels. This isn't very preferable because later on you'll find that when you're making websites, you want to make sure that they can be usable and readable over a bunch of different screen sizes. So if I specified, let's say I want to make that image of a bee like 1,000 pixels, it might look fine on my laptop, but if you take it on a phone, like and it's hard set to 1,000 pixels, there might be some trouble, seeing the edges of the photo, and it just wouldn't display the same way. So usually you wouldn't want to kind of hard set, like the pixel values. So yeah, but that does exist, and sometimes it is useful to use. And next we have percentage, which basically sizes the element based on the percentage of the size of the parent element that it exists in. So let's say you have this div, and inside you want to put like an H1 or even like another div. The sizing that you give this H1 text, if you use percentage, let's say this div class has a width of 300 pixels, and then you give this H1 tag a size of 50%, then it'll have a size of 150 pixels. So it's based on the percentage of the size of its parent element, or like the element that kind of wraps it. So yeah, and then REM and EM are pretty commonly used, I believe. So REM is relative to the size of the root element's text, like the root element of your HTML, which is the same across the entire like document. And then EM is relative to the size of the parent element's text. So if it's a little bit confusing to grasp, but if let's say the REM or the root element's text is like always 16 pixels, that's going to be the same across the entire document. And then EM, let's say the parent's element text has a size of 16 pixels. If you specified like 2 EM for one of its child elements, it would be like 32 pixels. And then it kind of like nests itself. So you just like keep multiplying, which can be a little bit confusing. So, people have different preferences for what they like to use. But yeah, those exist. And then VH/VW basically are the size, they size the element relative to the viewport height. And the viewport is effectively like the size of your screen. So as I'm dragging this around, the viewport width is changing on my like Chrome window. So yeah, that's what the viewport is. So viewport, so for example, like 40 VH would be 40% of the height of the viewport. And then 40 like VW would be the same, but with the width. So this sometimes is useful in, creating websites that work across like many different sizes of screens, which is called making your website responsive. So yeah, next we'll talk about specifying colors. So you guys already seen like the predefined colors that you have. There's a lot of them, but when you type color, you see all of them here. So we have like these predefined set of colors that you can use using plain English. And then you have RGBA, which is formatted as a list wrapped in parentheses. So this first value, or the first 3 values, go in between a range of 0 and 255. The first value is a red value, how much red there is. Second value is how much green. Third value is how much blue. And then the A is the opacity of the color, I believe. And then you can also do the same thing, but without the A. Pretty self-explanatory. And then hex is hexadecimal. You often hear people asking for the hex code of things. It's pretty good if you have like a specific set of like colors that you want to use. It's like a little bit shorter instead of like typing this big, this parentheses like every single time. So basically hexadecimal starts with a hashtag followed by 6-digit string of numbers between 0 and 9 and letters between A and F. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 is black and 6 Fs is white. But I don't know anything else. So yeah, you can, I mean, this is like the color picker, right? Like you have the big like map of colors. So you just select like a specific value. But yeah, hexadecimal is like very common. But yeah, okay. Any questions on this slide? Yeah. Sorry, what was that? The ending? Sizing units? Oh yeah, I very commonly see, it does depend on the use case, but REM and EM are pretty common as well as percentage. So yeah, I would look into, you know, like specific cases for like when you want to use things. And also like a big part of sizing is, you know, paying attention to responsiveness. So if you, you know, size something, you know, definitely try like changing the size of your viewport to see if anything like starts to look wrong. And then identify like maybe I use the wrong units here or there, and then fix it from there. But yeah. Oh yes, what's text sizes? No, they're not only used for text sizes. They're just relative to like the text size, which is a little bit unintuitive, but yeah, that's kind of, you can use it for anything. Yeah. Yes. So the root element is, it's a little bit hard to explain, but it's the, here, how do I explain this? It's kind of the thing that like wraps everything in your HTML document. So it kind of like encompasses everything that lives inside of your HTML, which is, it's basically the parent of everything else in your document. And then the parent element of a specific element is just the thing that immediately wraps it. So for example, here, this H1's parent element is the div class because it most like directly encompasses it. Yeah, which is why REM is kind of consistent throughout the entire document, but depending on where you place your tags or your elements, the EM value can change depending on what like it's nested under. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so we're gonna move on to the box model. Okay, so the box model is, we'll go back to another analogy. It's an easy way to kind of visualize like the sizing of things on your website. So yeah, going to this gift box analogy. So the box model encompasses 4 main things. So the width and the height, the padding, the border, and the margin. So if you're thinking about like a gift that you wrap for someone for Christmas or their birthday, the width and the height is kind of the size of the actual object itself. Like I was showing earlier, you can change like the size of the image of the bee into whatever you want by specifying width and height. And then in this little diagram here, which I'll tell you guys kind of the significance of this in the next slide. This is kind of, this blue is the actual object itself. So here you can see it's 565 wide and then 112 high. And then the padding is, you can kind of think of it as the amount of tissue paper or like bubble wrap that you put between the box and the gift to protect it. Obviously, like you're not actually protecting things on your website, but if you want to visualize it that way, if it helps. So then you have the border, which is the amount of wrapping paper you use to wrap the box or just the box itself. You know, it can have varying levels of thickness, like if you want to put it in a safe versus like a cardboard box. And then you have the margin, which is the amount of space between the box itself and like the box next to it. So yeah, that's kind of what the box model is. Here, let's see. Yeah, so basically, like, I can show you guys kind of an example of how the box model works. Let's see what's going on. Oh yeah. Okay, so with this photo here, I'm going to give it a padding of 20 pixels. So right now it has a width of 600 and a height of 400. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so you can see it. Oh God. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to give it a padding of 20 pixels and you'll see kind of how, or sorry, I already did. Let's make it like 100 pixels. And when I refresh, you'll, oh Lord. Okay, where did it go? Okay, that was strange. Let's not do 100, let's do like 40. All right, so you can see it kind of like got squashed. You can't really see what padding is doing yet until we add the border. So the border you can specify by specifying like the thickness of it. And then the next word is the style of it. So it can be solid, it can be dotted. I think it could be like dash. And then the last value is the color. So it should give a 5 pixel solid border to this image. And as you can see now, it is very evident that we did in fact add padding between the content of the div, or which is the actual image itself, and then the border. So imagine there's a lot of tissue paper here between the image and the box. And then if we want to change the margins, we want to move it away from other things. If you give it, let's say, a margin of 40 pixels, it should move everything away. Versus the padding, like if you make this smaller, only affects like the amount of space between the element itself and the border that surrounds it. So yeah, hopefully that like helps you kind of visualize what the box model actually does in practice. So yeah, and you can imagine like when you're spacing things around on a site, you don't want everything to be like touching, like flushed on the website. You want to be able to give things margins, and so that way you can move things around and rearrange like the stuff on your site to look like how you want it to. Yeah.
So let's say I don't want it to be 40 pixel margin all the way around.
Yeah.
Just like on the left or the right.
Yes.
Is there a way to like specify that?
Yes. I was actually just going to go into that, but that's a good question. So if you want to, let's say you only want it to be 40 pixels on the top, you can do margin dash top, and then similarly with left, right, or bottom. So we can see how that works. So you can see everything else, the margin everywhere else is gone, but it's only on this left-hand side, which I'll show you. Yeah, so it's only moving sideways. And then you can also do the same thing with padding. Oh gosh, no. Yeah, you can do the same thing with padding, like if you want to make the top 20 pixels, but everywhere else you want 0 pixels. Yeah, so you can specify that. And then another thing is that if you want to specify like all of the different sides at once, that's also something you can do in shorthand. So you can do just margin and then give it 4 values. And then the way that this is ordered is it starts from the top. So this first value is the top, and then it goes in a clockwise circle. So the second value is the right, and then bottom, and then left. So you can see that you can't really tell how much it moved, but that is a way to shorthand define like all the different values at once. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to move on into the developer tools. So this is it'll kind of be your best friend when you're doing front-end development. A lot of front-end, in my experience, has been figuring out why this button is like not where it's supposed to be. That's not all of it. Like front-end is very much a challenge in its own way and very important. But a lot of times like CSS can get really convoluted and it can be very difficult to understand like where certain styles are coming from. Why is my button green and not blue? Why is this text not centered? So basically developer tools is a set of tools that's built into all browsers. And to open it, you can hit Command/Control Shift C or right click on an element, like any element on the page, and press inspect. You guys probably know you can like change values of stuff on a website by doing this. Yeah, so Okay, so we're gonna kind of dive into what DevTools can help you do. Just kind of like as an overview, 4 examples of things you can do. Number one, you can click on certain like elements to see how their styling looks and where the styling has come from exactly. So basically, if you guys are already looking at it, you might see like a long list of selectors that are currently affecting the element that you're selecting. And you can also see where like the code that it actually comes from. And then lighthouse testing is a way to see how fast and accessible your site is. It can help with, fixing your SEO, which is search engine optimization. This is just like a nice thing that you can use. Number 3, making updates to your code without actually changing your code base. So inside of the developer tools, which we'll open up together soon, you can see that in those selectors, you can make like live edits to your properties, like their property values, without actually changing like your source code. It's just a good way to test, like, is this specific line causing problems? Like if I delete it, like what will happen? And you can also check the network tab to see servers. Okay, this is not relevant right now, but you can see like the website talking to the backend, see interactions and stuff, which you guys will get a better understanding of later. So yeah, let's open up DevTools together. So if you just click on a website and then use Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C, you'll see your developer tools. And yeah, so actually like, this has a quick tour. Here, this is nice. This allows you to basically hover over, this shows you like what is in your HTML. So every time you hover over an element, it shows you, it highlights using the colors that we saw earlier, like what you're selecting in this code. So for example, hovering over this H1 and it's telling me like if I click on it, you can see down here, this box that we saw earlier, it says that it has an orange box around it, which is the margin of 21.44 pixels, I believe. And then it also tells you like how big the actual element is. So this is a good way to see like which element is causing problems. Like if 2 things are too far apart, like is it the first thing that is too far away or the second thing? Or that's kind of a dumb example, but it's like small conflicts like those that developer tools can help you solve. And then on the right-hand side here, you can see styles, which like I was talking about earlier, I can directly like uncheck this property, which I think is pretty cool. You can also, like change this here. Oh, that was not right. There, and then you can see it update live in your browser. Like I said, this doesn't actually change your source code. This is a good way to like visualize things. And then here is a cool example of, do you see this strike through text right here? This basically tells you that this color property has been overridden by another selector. So you can imagine how that's helpful. Like if you want this text to be blue, right? Like everywhere, and you see that's crossed out, you can, kind of get an idea of what is going on and like where your actual coloring is coming from, which I think has been very useful to me in the past to kind of target like problems and see like the root cause of them. And yeah, so that's kind of like the main, kind of like what I've most commonly used, just seeing like what goes on like inside your website without just having to look on the surface level. And being able to toggle things, it's a pretty powerful way to like visualize things. And yeah, so those are the dev tools. Yeah, does anyone have questions about that? I'd recommend you go into all the tabs and like just look at what's going on. And yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so last slide, I believe. Okay, so best practices. Okay, so obviously, like with every lecture, we're going to talk about, best ways to write CSS or any type of language in general. So number 1 is to comment your CSS code if you have a very complex file. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of times your code is going to be passed down to other people. So like if you receive a CSS file that makes absolutely no sense, it's going to be very, very painful and challenging to try to decipher what the previous developer was thinking about when they were writing the file. So you can save the next guy or girl the headache by, writing comments. Comments are pretty standard practice in coding in general. Just makes handoff easier and makes it more readable. And comments are denoted by a slash and an asterisk in CSS. Another fun way to comment things is by selecting a line and pressing Command / and then it should automatically comment that line. But yeah. All right, and then group selectors are for if you're styling different things the exact same way, but they don't make sense to like go into the same class, which is kind of a nuanced situation. You can use commas to separate like these selector names, and then these styles will apply to all three of these, like H1, H2, and P. Then lastly, your CSS files should all start with this universal selector. Basically what this does, you don't really need to know why too much we use it, but it basically makes like sizing and manipulating the box model a lot easier. Basically what it says is that you should include the border and the padding to be like a part of the actual element itself. So you guys can research it more if you want to, but include this in every single CSS file that you write at the very top. And this will apply to every other selector. And it should make your life a lot easier if you're sizing things and trying to manipulate them on your page. So yeah, does anyone have any final questions? That's actually all the content that we have today. Okay, awesome. If you guys want to ask me any questions at the end, I'll be around. So yeah, this is the, I included a QR code for ease of access, but the magic word, wait.